Well, good morning. I always love coming to ISPCS. It's one of my favorite events of the year, and thank Wayne for that kind introduction. I've done a lot of talks here, several panels. I did one memorable keynote out on the patio in the howling wind, which I think was the last time that they did keynotes or speeches out on the patio. Most of the time I've talked about some aspect of space policy or the goings-on at ULA. And this year, many of you are probably interested to hear what we're doing to support Boeing on Commercial Crew or our new partnership with Blue Origin, but you'll have to catch me later on that. This year, my talk is completely different. And for me, it's a lot more personal. I think for you guys, it'll be different as well. Hopefully, you're well fortified with caffeine this morning or some other substance imported from Colorado. You know, it's kind of remarkable. You get opera and philosophy to start out your symposium. But anyway, I have a passion for philosophy. I know that sounds a little creepy. And last year I published a book called The Philosophy for the Future. I sent a courtesy copy to Pat, and much to my surprise, she actually read the book. And I'm told that that's no small feat. So she asked me to give this talk. It happens that one of the central themes of my book is power, and the power of 10 is the theme of this conference. So the concept power occurs in my book on several different levels. It's a unifying concept in the description of sociology and psychology. It's also a normative concept. Something to be aspired to, a goal. Did that work? Oops. On the descriptive side, Bertrand Russell, an English philosopher and logician, wrote, "The fundamental concept in social science is power, in the same sense that energy is a fundamental concept in physics." Friedrich Nietzsche, one of my favorite philosophers, viewed power, more precisely the will to power, as the unifying concept in psychology. Nietzsche believed the will to power imbues all living things. Where I found the living, there I found will to power. So digging a little deeper and perhaps getting a bit more pedantic, the sociology literature distinguishes between power to, which I think of as capability, and power over, in which one person has power over another like a tyrant. Power over, when taken to an extreme, can be evil. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's the saying. And we see examples of that throughout history and in the world today. The concept of power I wish to focus on is power to. And that's the concept that's the theme of this conference. It's the power to do, power to achieve, power to accomplish great things, power to make of ourselves what we will. This concept, I think, is affirming and supremely inspirational. Okay, so now let me get even more pedantic and torture you with a formal definition of power to. I conceived of this almost 20 years ago when I was sitting in my cubicle at Lockheed Martin. I think my bosses thought I was doing rocket science. Alas, they were wrong. But anyway, I was looking to find a way to quantify power as a way to use it as a utility in a formal decision theory. This means that power should be quantifiable as a number and applicable to an agent. An agent's a fancy philosophical term for a decision maker in pursuit of some goal. You and I are all agents. So per my definition, the power of an agent is the maximum difference in possible future states of the world, achievable through potential courses of action available to the agent. At the bottom of that slide, you can see it written in symbols, and I'm seeing a lot of puzzled looks out there, so let me give you a couple of examples. So imagine that you're in a prison cell for the rest of your life with no means to communicate with the outside world or otherwise affected. Every course of action that you have available to you, and you don't have many in that situation, lead to the same exact future. So if you look at the two terms inside the absolute value bars, those are the same. The difference is 0. Your power is 0. You were utterly powerless in that situation. So now let's look at the other extreme. Suppose you get bored of the conference and you decide to go for a hike up in the Oregon Mountains north of here, and you come across an alien artifact that contains plans for anti-gravity and warp drive. It's not that far-fetched. We're in New Mexico, after all, right? But anyway, now you have a choice. You could destroy the artifact, in which case the future state of the world would be as if the artifact had never existed. Or you could take the artifact and use it to create marvelous capability to allow humans to expand out into the galaxy and beyond. The difference between those two future states is vast, and hence your power is enormous. So based on this definition of power of an individual agent, we can define the power of a group. And what you will find is that the power of a group increases exponentially with group membership, based on the possibility of cooperation. Agents who cooperate to achieve a mutual goal are capable of so much more than any individual. We all know this intuitively, but the mathematics of power show it explicitly. From here, we can talk about power of societies and nations, and ultimately of humankind as a species. We can also talk about different flavors of power obtained by restricting our definition to certain kinds of future effects or capabilities. Pat already mentioned it, but physical power is the ability to affect the physical state of the world. This is the power of the engineer. Roads, buildings, cars, planes, rockets, satellites, iPhones are all manifestations of physical power. Technology is its currency. We can also talk about economic power, or political power, or military power. Recall Bertrand Russell's analogy that I started this talk with. Those of us in the space business understand how different forms of energy can be converted into one another, right? If you take chemical energy out of propellants in a rocket, are converted on launch of that rocket into kinetic energy and gravitational potential energy of the satellite in orbit. In the same way, different kinds of power can be converted into one another. Economic power can be converted into physical power by investing in technology. Physical power can lead to military power through the development of weapon systems. Economic power can lead to political power through lobbying or contributions or bribes. You get the idea. Another interesting kind of power is what I call scientific power. It's a property of your worldview, or of the scientific worldview. And it's a mixture of explanatory power and predictive power. Without going into detail, it's probably pretty obvious that you can convert scientific power into physical power through technology. So with this concept of power, let me make a fairly bold claim that the will to power has been and remains one of the driving forces in human history. The will is manifest at both the individual and group levels. That is, each human seeks as part of his or her basic nature to increase his or her personal power. And that human groups seek to increase their collective group power. These dual drives lead to the central tension in human nature between individualism and collectivism. In my book, I go into detail about the evolutionary origin of these drives and how they're linked to the forces that drove the evolution of intelligence. But now I want to shift gears and talk about power as a normative concept. Philosophers have made a great deal of the distinction between descriptive language, or the recounting of facts, and normative language, or the stating of goals or ideals or values. The famous naturalistic fallacy is conflating the way the world is with the way the world ought to be. In logic, it's what's called a category error. The bottom line is that to bridge the gap between science, which describes what the world is and how it works, and ethics or policy making, which provide ideals or norms about how the world ought to be and how we ought to act, we need an additional ingredient. What we need is another premise, an axiom to the mathematicians. What we need is an overarching goal. Oops. So my proposal for the overarching goal of humankind is long-term viability of the species. Pretty straightforward. I mean, in other words, we should try at all costs to avoid extinction. That seems pretty self-evident. So give me a show of hands. How many of you believe that that should be one of our goals? I think those of you that didn't raise your hand are sleeping, or I should talk to you after this. Anyway, it's not necessarily the only goal, but it's certainly foundational. Okay, so we agree on that. Let's take the next step. It's my claim that maximizing long-term species power, as I've defined it earlier, is the best means, the optimum means to achieve long-term viability of the species. In my book, I gave a pretty lengthy and, I think in my opinion at least, a fairly compelling justification for this claim. But here let me describe a thought experiment that gives you an intuitive feel for it. So imagine an immense Monte Carlo simulation where innumerable futures are played out. In some of those futures, a killer asteroid strikes, or an advanced alien civilization is encountered. In others, catastrophic climate change occurs, or terrorists gain nuclear weapons, or a genetically engineered plague is loosed. So now think, what policy, if adopted globally, will lead to the greatest statistical occurrence of long-term viability? It's species power, pure and simple. The ability to detect and repel an asteroid, the ability to survive an encounter with a potential hostile alien race, the ability to control the climate, the ability to provide global security, the ability to control and defeat pathogens. These are the keys to our long-term success. So now that we've established power as the ultimate goal, and with the quantitative definition I provided, we can construct a decision theory based on power as a utility. And I won't go into the mathematics of decision theory, and it's explained in my book in depth. But with that, you can construct a very satisfying, at least in my opinion, ethical theory. In other words, power underpins, it justifies all of morality. It's pretty amazing. But I want to move beyond ethics into the realm of broad policymaking. I recognize there's much room for debate on this topic, but with maximizing power as the overarching goal, I've identified 3 elements of a plan to move humanity into the future. First is global political unification. You know, this might irritate some of the more nationalistic out there, but I think the logic is unassailable. The cooperative power of a unified humanity would be astounding. Imagine the enormous benefits of global security unleashing the cooperative potential of all 7 billion human individuals. Imagine if the resources we now spend around the world on military endeavors and geopolitical conflict could be redirected into goals that benefit all, such as scientific research and technology development, or expanding human presence into space. Just imagine. This gets me to part 2 of the plan, enhance science and technology. It should be obvious by now, but increasing overall scientific understanding, scientific power, if you will, directly increases species power. There are a number of technology areas that hold great promise in the modern world. They go by the acronym GRIN, G-R-I-N. G for genetic or biotechnology, R for robotics, I for information technology, and N for nanotechnology. Advances in all of these should be pursued with great vigor. The third part of the plan is human expansion into space. In the book, I lay out a number of different arguments as to why this should be our objective, which I won't repeat here. But in essence, if the overarching goal of humanity is to increase our power as a species, then expansion into space is an obvious and vital means toward that end. This brings me to a final point in connecting the concept of power as I've described it, and power is defined by a physicist, in other words, the rate of energy delivered measured in watts. In a 1964 article in the journal Soviet Astronomy, Nikolai Kardashev defined a scale to measure the level of advancement of a civilization. It was generalized somewhat by Carl Sagan, another one of my heroes, and it reads like this, as you can see on the screen. It's basically the log of the power output of the civilization with appropriate scaling factors. To better align it with my definition, I like to think of it as the power controllable by that civilization. So with that definition in mind, a Type 1 civilization can control its planet, or cislunar space, if you will. A Type 2 civilization can control its solar system. A Type 3 civilization can control its galaxy, and a Type 4 civilization is in control of the entire known universe. Humans are currently paltry 0.7, not quite in control of our planet. So based on all this, our goal should be to ascend this ladder from 0.7 to 1 to 2 and beyond. And to this end, deriving economic benefit from space is essential. It's the key to making the space enterprise self-sustaining. And the key to deriving economic benefit from space is commercialization. In other words, the commercialization of space is essential for the sustainability of the space enterprise, and it's thus essential for the long-term viability of our species. And I think that's why we're all here today. It's why we've been coming to this sort of remote location in the desert for the last 10 years. And that, I think, is the power of 10. So thank you, and I think I left some time for questions.
Let's see, George, we're getting a couple of questions for you here. Thank you. So, from the audience here in the room, how do you blend your power as an ultimate goal with your widely held religious and moral philosophies calling for selflessness? How would you blend those?
Well, I don't believe there's a conflict. I think power, as I've defined it for the entire species, inherently involves cooperation. You get the most out of power as a species by cooperating with others. And part of cooperation is selflessness. But if you read my book, my political philosophy is pretty libertarian because I believe in the power of the individual as well. After all, groups are aggregates of individuals, and the more powerful we are individually, the more we can contribute to the group and overall. I had a professor at the University of Colorado, philosophy professor, reviewed my book, and he described my politics as a blend between Ayn Rand and Bill Clinton. So, I'm not sure if that was a compliment.
We'll have to give that a little bit of thought. Do we have I see we got a couple more questions while they're bringing you up here. I'd like to say I appreciate the chair because having a chance to sit and talk and think about these subjects is important.
Well, I told Pat that you can't do philosophy standing up. It doesn't work.
Let's see. Mandela in prison. Did he have power? To start with your first example, Nelson Mandela.
Absolutely he did, because he had the ability to communicate. He was not held incommunicado. And he came out and was able to amass great political power and become the whatever it is, president of South Africa.
Okay, and here's a question that resounds with me. It says general political unification, if I'm reading this right. Global political unification and expansion into space are the underlying theme of the Star Trek TV series. Would you like to comment on that?
I'm a Trekkie. I love Star Trek. But, I have no illusions about the difficulty of global political unification. I don't think it's around the corner. I think you can be very patriotic and love your country and still be for global political unification. I kind of resonated with, one of the few things I resonated with George Bush, the younger, was, his New World Order. That if you can create a security environment around the world and an economic integration around the world, then you're on a path to global unification.
Very good. Any other questions here? Well, thank you, George. We certainly appreciate your talk this morning. George Sowers, Vice President of the United Launch Alliance.